Welcome to the Millennial Body Image Project. We're two licensed dietitian nutritionists bringing you conversations that cut through the food noise, debunk wellness trends, and remind you that it's not you, it's the systems stacked against you.
Together, we'll explore the struggles so many of us carry, challenge the fear-mongering that fuels them, and offer evidence-based, compassionate tools to support your body on its own terms.
Because your lived experience matters, and your body is not the problem.
On today's episode, I'm joined by dietitian Cheryl Harris for a deep and very needed conversation about hypermobility and hypermobile ehlers-danlos syndrome, also known as EDS. Cheryl shares her own lived experience with chronic pain and hypermobility and helps us decipher what's often brushed off as being, quote, just bendy versus when hypermobility becomes something that significantly and negatively impacts daily life. We spend time myth-busting common misconceptions about hypermobility and hEDS and talk about why so many people struggle for years, sometimes decades, to get an accurate diagnosis. Cheryl also draws connections with gut health, the nervous system, POTS, mast cell activation, and even neurodivergence, and why they so often don't exist in isolation. Throughout the episode, we'll explore how all of this can affect nutrition, food tolerance, and your relationship with food, especially when you're managing multiple overlapping health concerns. So for anyone who's navigating chronic symptoms, medical gaslighting, or trying to make sense of how their body actually works, this episode is for you. We do mention a lot of acronyms in this episode, so there will also be a cheat sheet in the show notes just for you.
Okay. All right. Well, Cheryl, thank you so much for coming on the show today. For those listeners who don't know you, one, welcome. And we're going to be talking a lot about EDS and hypermobility today. So before we even really get into what is EDS and what is hypermobility and how does this affect food and maybe even body image and wherever we decide to go with this conversation, I would love for you to introduce yourself to the listeners by telling them a little bit about you and how did you arrive to specializing in this area as a dietitian now?
Yeah, that is such a great question. And first of all, I'm delighted to be here. And I'm so delighted that you've decided to, dedicate time to this super important topic. I have been a dietitian for 23, almost 24 years. I've had chronic pain since I was 15, so a longer chunk of my life, but not by far. And when I was in my early 20s, the chronic pain had gotten to a point where I was no longer able to walk. I'm condensing a whole lot of things. And I had a chiropractor who was just like, "You're bendy, like really bendy." And that was the first time I had come across the term hypermobile. And I didn't understand the difference between what's known as benign hypermobility because there are a lot of people who are hypermobile. Like Simone Biles is hypermobile. Like there are a lot of people who are like the Olympic gymnasts and the ballerinas of the world are hypermobile, but that's an advantage. Except there are a lot of people who are hypermobile who are like me, where it was causing problems and, really affecting quality of life in a negative way. And that was where I was starting to understand the difference between hypermobility when that was a good thing, like when I was a little kid and was doing the funky tricks that would freak my sister out, versus hypermobility when that was like causing me to not be able to walk. So that was when I was starting to be able to understand, like, quote unquote, what they call like the benignly bendy versus when it started to be problematic. So that was sort of my early 20s when I started understanding that part of the arena. But it was many more years until I formally got a diagnosis. But I did start actually working with people with EDS in my early 20s. I was very lucky that the first place I started working, people actually were seeing all types of EDS because there are many, many flavors of ehlers-danlos.
And so when you had started to see people who were already diagnosed, where you're like, wait a minute, maybe this is something I should look into for myself.
Both yes and no. So some of the types of ehlers-danlos are so, I'm going to say extreme. Like you can some of the things you see, especially some of the rarer types, when it's like, when you visually see them, it's like, oh, okay. Like, you'll literally see people's bones pop out and be like, okay, well, I'm in a ton of pain, but I can't do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I think some of the moral of the story is comparing isn't always the best, because everyone's going to present differently, and that doesn't really mean a whole lot. And so even though I kept going to doctors and saying like, are you sure? Are you sure? And kept saying like, no, because of something called the bite and scale, which is a whole nother story. I did have my suspicions, but when I was comparing someone with, let's say, classical EDS to what was going on with me, it's like, well, it is of course going to look different because it's a whole nother disease.
It is so interesting that you mentioned that, because I feel like when people come to me or to you also, well, maybe not to you because you specialize in this, but when someone who's not an EDS and like mast cell and POTS or dysautonomia specialist, right? And they have these complex health conditions that are going on, they hear something like EDS, they're like, oh, well, my organs seem to be fine. Like I seem to be, they might be in pain, but like their joints aren't subluxing. Like there's so many different things that aren't happening for them. And they may be thinking like, oh, they don't have, what some rheumatologists have called like the quote scary forms of EDS, but they don't even know that there's necessarily like the hypermobile EDS or like hypermobility spectrum disorder and anything. So they might, have a similar experience to you of like, oh, well, I don't have the scary kind, so, maybe it's not me. But I do think that there's a wide range of like a lack of information on EDS for the general population of people who only think it is quote unquote, the scary kind. And they're like, oh, well, I don't have all that stuff, so it couldn't be me.
Yeah. And I think some people know the Bite and criteria and like, can you do certain things with your thumbs? And I actually can't do many of those things, but many of my issues are actually in my feet and in my hips and in my shoulders and in my neck. And those are actually joints that the Bite and criteria doesn't look at. And there's actually a movement, and most likely while the Bite and criteria will stay the same, there are probably actually other joints that will be added in, and that'll probably happen in the end of 2026. So that for people like me, because like there's nothing magical about the joints measured in the Bite and criteria. And there's nothing more important about your thumb versus your shoulder or your neck or your feet, because if those joints aren't working, like that can hugely affect your quality of life. I absolutely have patients who are like in and out of the emergency room because they're dislocating their shoulders or their knees. And it's just like, that's not going to affect you any more or less. It's going to, hugely have an impact on your quality of life. So it's knowing that the Bite and criteria can be very useful, but it is also very limiting if you don't fit into that narrow box. And I know for me, I bounced between doctors for 30 years and went to over 100 doctors saying like, hey. And I finally ended up going to one of the top specialists in the world and being like, what is happening? Like, why do some people say, I'm one of the most bendy people they've ever seen, and someone else is like, but you're not, but you meet these criteria. And then he finally was like, explained, and then finally gave me an HSD diagnosis. And it was, for me, one of the most clarifying moments of my life, because it was like, finally, this whole journey had made sense. Because before that, it was just like, I had, I'm going to say 20 diagnoses that seemed entirely unconnected. And then finally, I had one diagnosis that all the other ones fell under. And that was so clarifying, because it kept being like, why are you, what sometimes it seemed like, or what I felt like I was getting from doctors, and sometimes what I will still get from doctors who don't understand EDS, is just like, well, how could you possibly have all these different conditions? But if you think of it from this lens of, okay, if you have faulty connective tissue, that is going to be from your head to your toe. That is going to affect all of your organ systems. Then actually it does make sense that all of your organ systems are going to be affected. And then you can have issues if not in every organ system, but in many of them. Otherwise, it almost just seems like you're just complaining and making up random symptoms. So it was certainly a huge weight up and a huge relief for me.
Yeah. Equal opportunity issues throughout the body for connective tissue issues. It does not discriminate based on organ system or anything. So I think a lot of people have experienced that moment of like, oh my gosh, like with a diagnosis of it being very bittersweet of like, oh my gosh, I finally have some answers. And if not tying everything together, it may make a lot of things make more sense. But then
Yeah.
also when you get that diagnosis, you're like, oh crap, like something else for me to figure out, you know? And
Mhm.
I work with many people, and I'm sure you've had this experience as well, is you'll see people who have a lot of various complex, seemingly unexplained symptoms. They've been passed around from hopefully not 100 doctors, but like many, many practitioner to practitioners. So if someone is, maybe looking up hypermobility spectrum disorder or just like being hypermobile or EDS or anything like that, at what point do you think, or what are maybe some of the telltale signs, even though everyone is so different, right? That it's worth thinking about, like, maybe I should look into these criteria, especially since there's no current validated genetic test for hEDS.
Yeah. And okay, I know I just said that the Biden criteria is limited, and it is, but it's a decent starting spot. The newer, the September conference, the EDS Society conference, what they're moving toward is going to be an idea of having symptoms in a range of systems. And that includes things like the GI system, the autonomic system, the immune system. So rather than essentially just kind of like, hey, Biden criteria, like looking at, do you have, and this isn't decided yet, so it's not like I'm just not telling you, like it hasn't been decided, but it's knowing that people do, like something like 30 to 40% of people do have POTS, 70% of people do have dysautonomia, 90% of people do have GI issues, over 50% of people do have migraines, a huge percentage of people do have some sort of neurodivergence. So it's kind of looking at it through the lens of, in terms of like also the hypermobility, like, do your joints move beyond the typical range of motion? And not just the hypermobility gang sign joints, but like, do things pop in and out? Do you like, there's some chairs when I sit in and it's like, moo, 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 like you can hear my spine make noises. Like there's, that's not something you can easily measure, but you can hear it and it's funky. I mean, people will talk about, like a lot of my patients, like their hips popping in and out, or they can feel their ankle joints pop in and out. So it's sort of like when I have patients either who are constantly spraining things, or they have those sort of senses of like, or they used to be a dancer or a gymnast, or like those sorts of things where like there's more mobility. So either sort of like lots of symptoms clustering in the places that people with EDS, their symptoms cluster, or their joints are moving further than they used to, or they did when they were a kid, because of course, when you start being my age, things start tightening up. One or the other of those would be a good indicator that hypermobility EDS or HSD may be part of the clinical picture.
Yeah. And you know what I find is frustrating as well is when, if people do start to think that, oh, this might be me, like I'm relating with a lot of these different things that you're talking about. You look at the diagnostic criteria, and one of them is, oh, well, you have to have a direct family member who has a diagnosis. We've just talked about how hard it is to get a diagnosis. And then the other thing is, whose parents are getting, unless this was very obvious from a young age, who in like the 80s and the 90s and the 70s and before that was getting diagnosed with this, right? So someone may meet almost all, like they may even have the Baton scale, right? They may have all of that. They may have so many of these other things. And it's like, oh, wait, you don't have like an abdominal prolapse or anything. And you also don't have a direct family member. So it's not you. And then it's so common. And this works for EDS and HSD, but then also a lot of other chronic, conditions and stuff is like, oh, you don't meet this one thing, even though every single other thing you're checking off all of these boxes, it's probably not you. And a lot of people will leave, a medical specialist and be like, well, now I feel like I have no answers. And what do I do now? And like from personal experience, that is so exhausting. So exhausting.
So at the risk of getting on my soapbox, like there's a certain amount of, it takes, I'm going to say money or resources to go to the doctor. And then they turn around and say like, but why are all the people who are diagnosed with EDS, with POTS, with mast cell, like, why is it only white middle-class women? And it's like, because those are the people who typically have the resources to go to all of these freaking specialists.
Yep.
And they're like, well, no one else has these conditions. It's like, that's not true. A lot of times, many other folks can't afford to go to all these specialists because they make the bar so high. And so I don't think that it's that other folks don't actually have the conditions. It's that oftentimes when they make the diagnostic bar so high, then other people often get shut out of diagnostic whatever. And so I'm hoping the 2026 criteria, whatever it ends up being, takes those things into account, because there's all this hand-wringing of why don't we have better representation? And it's like, well, maybe that needs to be taken into account when they're writing diagnostic criteria and, accessibility of these things. But I digress. See?
Well, so speaking of diagnostic criteria, you were mentioning before that we have seen a real spike in either actual diagnoses, which we know are very hard to come by, but then also just like awareness of EDS and the hypermobility spectrum. Where do you think that comes from?
Okay, so one of the things is that, because I do remember what things were like in the early 2000s. And I know that my understanding of EDS was very different than it is now. Like the information that was around in the early 2000s was very different. So my only conclusion is just that the information that was around was incomplete. But so it's knowing there wasn't a lot of information around the early 2000s. There weren't a lot of doctors. It was very hard to find things. But kind of like and there are many more organizations, there are many more classes, so there's much more outreach now. But the other part that's really quite interesting, and I can certainly give you a lot of studies to put in your show notes. Okay, so 2020, a significant chunk of people got viruses, COVID. One of the things that came into literature is that like when you get COVID or really any virus, there's like any virus, there's going to be like mast cell activation and I'm super, super, super simplifying. Like when mast cells activate, they dump hundreds of mediators. We hear about histamine, there's heparin, there's kinases, there's all those different things. But among many of the inflammatory things they do, they weaken connective tissue, where they have the potential to weaken connective tissue. So let's say you've got someone who's always sort of been teetering on the edge of hypermobility, but let's say like me, like I was always hypermobile as a little kid, but only when I turned like 20s, it went from being like benignly bendy to being like problematic. It may be, and again, this is just a hypothesis, that there were some people who were just like, were bendy. And then after getting COVID a certain number of times, it went from being benignly bendy to, expressing hypermobile EDS or HSD. That's a hypothesis. I can't tell you that that's quote unquote true. But that lines up with sort of like what we have seen. Yeah. It's it'll be interesting sort of like as the dust settles to see, because that's lined up with what's shown up in the literature. But it's not like, because this was sort of like something that was seen globally, it's not like we have a quote unquote control group.
Right. Yeah.
But
Well,
I'm happy to give you studies, because I'm sure you'll have listeners who will want to know more about that.
yeah. Well, lucky for the listeners, I have already many of the studies that you
Okay.
have used, at least. Well, unless anything's new in like the past 2 months or maybe 3 months, because
Oh, there
background for
are.
the listeners. Okay, cool. I'll get those. Background for the listeners. The reason I found Cheryl, which is so funny because we're both in the same area of the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, is I was taking a course on medical nutrition therapy for EDS and hypermobility. And I was like, oh my God, this would be a great guest for the podcast. Because one of the things that, I mean, the listeners know Christina and I love to do is to bring the research in a very teachable, digestible way and make sure that we're filtering this through an appropriate lens for people who have a history or current history of disordered eating or eating disorders. And how do we interpret this, what could be very kind of scary information and overwhelming information? Because,
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, it was a 4-part course that we did. This is like the tip of the iceberg. Like, you haven't even seen 2 inches below the surface when it comes to EDS and hypermobility, even from that course, right? And so it's really difficult because when you were talking about COVID and how viral exposure can impact this stuff, we also have seen with COVID in general, but then also long COVID, there is more POTS that we're seeing around. And we
Yes.
know that there is a big trifecta of EDS and hypermobility and mast cell and POTS. And I have seen over the past couple of years, those are like the main 3 groups of things that I see, right? And then we have co-occurring conditions, and we have a lot of people with GI disorders, like you've seen. People know I specialize in GI, and then we see a lot of people with neurodivergence. And it's like, okay, we're not looking at a Venn diagram of a triangle right now. Now we're seeing many, many, many circles are being added to this Venn diagram to the point where there's a lot of overlap for all these different things, which then can make it feel overwhelming and can make it seem really, really complicated. But as you expressed after seeing 100 or so doctors, you might finally be able to get that moment of like, here are where all of the dots are coming together. But then also, like you said, access makes it a lot harder to do that. So there are so many people that are just left floating on some driftwood in the ocean, be like, oh, maybe it's this thing. Oh, maybe it's this thing. Oh no, you don't have a direct family member and you're not bendy in this like very specific way. Couldn't be you.
And and I'm so glad you're talking about this, because there is a paper that came out on eating disorders and GI last week, and somehow they managed not to talk eating disorders, GI, and connective tissue, and somehow they managed not to talk about neurodivergence. And it's just like, guys, we got to put this all together. So close, so close. I mean, it's knowing that I know it's just, there's so many things that are emerging, and there are so many people where it's putting the pieces together, and the pieces just haven't congealed yet. I know I'm seeing many people talking about it on podcasts and the internet, whatever else, but I think a lot of times, like broadly, it just hasn't been discussed that I don't think you can talk about connective tissue disorders without always talking about neurodivergence and eating disorders, like that those are things that have to be discussed as interconnected parts, meaning like that there should never be a paper talking about EDS that doesn't mention eating disorders and neurodivergence, like that those are just inseparable parts. That's just my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yes. Oh, 100%. Well, yeah. So I'd love to go into that a little bit more and how we actually see that as practitioners showing up in people with, let's call it just food issues to be colloquial. But when you're having whatever touch points people have here, and it could be one, it could be multiple of them, when we're thinking about either disordered eating or eating disorders, or even before that has even become a point of awareness, if you have EDS, if you have hypermobility, any kind of connective tissue thing, if you have neurodivergence, if you have GI issues, if you have any of these things that we've talked about, all of those could lead to an altered diet or an attempt to either control or mediate your symptoms through dietary changes. And we have seen with all of these groups of people, and then especially when you have a person that has all of those touch points, you end up with people who are on an extremely limited diet. And whether that's due to they're trying to manage their symptoms, or they have had specific symptoms with specific foods, or they've done research and they say, oh, well, I should be doing maybe this diet and then also this diet and then maybe also this one. And then we combine all of them, and then they come to us and they're left with 5 to 10 foods and they're still having symptoms. So how do you see that show up?
I would say that that's one of the most common presentations. And one of the common questions people ask is, what diet do you give people? And what I try to explain to people is that, my job as I see it is, I usually don't get to see people before they're like glommed onto a diet, but often my job is explaining, hopefully, that there's no magical diet that is going to fix it. And I try to actually explain the biology of there's not going to be a magical diet, or my take is that there's not going to be a magical diet. And why that ideally our job is actually to try to build back people's food, because most of the people I'm seeing are sometimes malnourished is a little bit of a strong word, but not eating sufficient nutrients. And that the process is one of, okay, first let's try to build in the pyramid. And that's often like, okay, whether that's POTS lifestyle medication, mast cell lifestyle medication, pain management. So it's sort of like, how do we build you up so that you're robust enough that we can add in food? Because just saying like add in food, like if people felt like they could add in food, they'd be doing that themselves. Mm-hmm. But it's sort of like, how do we build people up so that they feel comfortable adding in food? Like whether that's like treatment for arthritis, it's going to be different for different people, but we're not serving people if we just say like, just eat more. Because if someone already felt like they could do that, they'd already be doing that. And I'm sure that's something that you're already doing as well.
Yeah, and it's difficult too, right? Because when you talk about, is there a magic diet or a supplement or anything for EDS, and the answer is simply no, and that is supported in the research. On the one hand, because it's not just EDS, right? It's all these other comorbidities that we're seeing. But then at the same time, that's only if we're looking at things from a physiological approach rather than a mental health and nervous system approach as well. Is you may have many GI reactions to certain foods, but is that some kind of imbalance that's happening in the GI system? Is that a motility issue? Or is that because maybe you have a negative association with some food, you've developed so much fear and anxiety around that food that now your IBS is triggered, and anytime that you eat this, you are having a reaction, right? And part of this, I think, is validating people's experiences and saying like, I want to meet you where you are, instead of like, oh, we'll just follow this protocol and you'll be fine, because they've probably had that before. And it obviously hasn't worked, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. I say that to people all the time, right? And not to say like all your other practitioners are, bad or weren't helpful or whatever, right? We pick up little nuggets of knowledge along the way, and all of your experiences are helpful and valid, but also just like validating people's experience and trying to meet them where they are, and then trying to say, okay, I see you. I see that this is difficult. Let's try and figure out how, like you said, how can we try to expand this and go in different ways about that, and to say, okay, well, if this one way didn't work, then let's try other stuff. That doesn't mean that this is the only possible thing that can help you, because lucky for you, you have a lot of things going on. So we can take a lot of different angles to try and work on this. And I find that, for myself personally in my own health journey, and then working with so many different people over the years, is you just got to be flexible, right? If you think you only have one answer, my God, you're wrong.
Yeah. And I know that among people with EDS, the rate of PTSD is 10 times higher than the average population. So it's knowing that going slow and gently and having patience, like having everything be collaborative. And so knowing that even if I might be an expert in some things, but someone else is most definitely the expert, the undisputed expert of their body, and they know what they are willing to do and what they are not willing to do, and when they are willing to do it and how they are willing to do it. So it always needs to entirely be a collaborative effort. And so approaching people as like, all right, this is a partnership. How are we going to do this together? And understanding that people have probably had bad experiences with other providers, even other providers who've met well. That's the only way to. So it's not always just about like the wonderful knowledge that's in our head. It's like, how is this going to be most effective for a patient? Because it can be so hard. It can be so hard, especially, when people have had bad experiences in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. And then a big part of that is figuring out how can we bring that nervous system response down so you can create some safety in session with your practitioner. And it takes a while to do that. I'll always say on my first session with people, you do not need to spill your whole life story to me because we just met. We will build that over time. You are welcome to if you would like to, but you really don't have to, because, and I'm sure you hear this also, is people start to tell their health history and their story and stuff. They're like, oh, I'm so sorry I'm taking so long. No. Take all the time you need, because this is so complicated and you have so much history, and it really does help to unpack that if the space feels safe enough to do that, But yeah, it's just complicated, and we're all complicated, and it's okay that we're complicated.
It is. It's a really tender process. It's a really vulnerable process. It's a really brave process for people to be willing to work with a dietitian, and especially for people who are listening, and just have so much appreciation for people who are willing to open up and to be willing to go through it. It's not easy. And yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I would love to do some debunking or like myth busting, because
Sure.
I'm sure you've seen there's so many little, snippets and tidbits and stuff out there about hypermobility and EDS, which I'm sure all of you will see this on your Instagram or TikTok feeds or whatever.
Ooh,
'cause if
and
you're
can we
listening
start
to
with that
us-
one? Can we start
yeah.
with the first one, that like hypermobility is the same as EDS? Because it's
Yep,
not.
that is what I was going to ask. We're on the same page. Yes, go into that.
Okay, because like in theory, like hypermobility is somewhere between, it can even be 20 to even up to 50% of the population. And so hypermobility, okay, so you're just bendy, good for you. Like you can spend your whole life bendy and be healthy. So I'm not worried about people who are like hypermobile. I'm only worried about people with EDS or HSD. Some people go from hypermobility to hEDS or HSD. That's when like people need to come see us, and that's when it's an issue. But just hypermobile, nope, cool, enjoy.
Enjoy your party tricks.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So can you explain that difference to people a little bit? Is like, so we've talked about the benign hypermobility, but then what about someone who suspects that like they're not sure if it's hEDS, so hypermobile EDS, or it's quote just like a hypermobile spectrum disorder?
Yeah, so the main differential and the main way it's expressed at this point is if you're bendy and you don't have pain and you aren't dislocating, and you aren't like dislocating to the point where like you're causing injury, it's not considered a problem. So like there are some people who are just stretchy, bendy, like they're just flexible. So if you're just flexible, that's not a problem. But if you're dislocating things, subluxing things, ending up in the ER, ending up in pain, and especially in pain for months, yeah, you're part of our club. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can be bendy, but it's not a connective tissue issue.
And there are some people who do move from one camp to the other. So like if you're bendy and you're not in any pain, and you're not in any pain and you're not injuring yourself, okay, cool.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so connective tissue. I'm sure some people are wondering, oh, well then should I just take a collagen supplement?
Yeah, and that's kind of like the idea if someone needed a blood transfusion and was kind of like vampire style, like, well, couldn't I just drink blood? Like, it's kind of like an analogy, and I'm sorry if someone's like listening to this in the morning with breakfast, like it's good.
Well, we talk about GI stuff all the time on here, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend listening to this while you're eating breakfast, but maybe you do and you're totally fine and not squeamish.
No, but the idea is like, okay, so you take the collagen supplement, your digestive tract breaks it down, and then you have the same sort of like amino acids. But if your body still does not, and the belief is that our bodies still, EDS bodies, HSD bodies, aren't, the extracellular matrix not quite putting things together right. Okay, still just not quite assembling things right. The only way that a collagen supplement would help someone with EDS is if they're just not eating enough amino acids to begin with, in which case a collagen supplement wouldn't help more than just eating enough protein to begin with, in which case, like, hey, you need to eat enough protein because, like, you need enough fuel, period. But, like, yeah. There's no benefit over just enough fuel, period.
The way I describe this analogy to people is like, imagine you have like a 500-piece puzzle, but you cannot figure out how to put the puzzle pieces together. Just adding like another 100 pieces to the table is not going to help you figure out how to put those puzzle pieces together any easier. In fact, it might actually make it more difficult.
That makes sense. Absolutely.
Oh, man. Okay, so I'm sure people have seen a lot of stuff about EDS and hypermobility on social media. What have you seen is one of the biggest things that you would like to debunk? Or have you seen anything that you're just like, oh, no, not that?
Oh, my goodness. There are a couple of supplement protocols where they're like, take these 30 supplements with these, however, 20, 30 supplements, and like, poof, you'll be cured. And I promise you, like, no, like, you're just going to be, a couple $100 per month, and 30% of people with, HEDS, HSD, like, have dysphagia. So, like, you're not going to level the swallowing, but like, it's not going to do anything magical.
Yeah. Oh, it's so tough. So, okay, we have talked about how there's a big crossover between disordered eating patterns, EDS, but then also neurodivergence, right? And of course, like a lot of these different GI-related symptoms that come up. One of the things that I really loved in terms of action steps about your course and the way that you talk about nutrition for EDS and all of these different things is you had this one section on, here are some suggestions or recommendations for eating when nothing sounds good. So I would love if you could talk about that.
I do try to make things like workable for people, and especially for people with, well, I'm going to say for people with neurodivergence, but just in general, I'm really a big fan of just, whether it's with a dietitian or just in general, trying to come up with lists of like, okay, what if you just have no energy? What would be lists of just like things that would be pretty easy? Would that be like, I don't know, a drink, like a pre-made shake? Would that be like And again, like whether these are meals, whether these are snacks, like coming up with things that would be appropriate for you, given the size meal/snack. Is this going to be like a bar, a cheese stick, a frozen meal? And again, this is going to have to like depend on like the sensory characteristics, like peanut butter and an apple, like you do you. So coming up with the things that appeal to you, like, is this going to be a can of soup? Like things that you can make in 60 seconds or less, things that are not necessarily, oh, I'm going to chop an onion and make a meal, but like things that are more like assembly, just a cup of yogurt, those sorts of things. And I have a lot of patients who will come up with a list together and then they will like put it on the refrigerator so that when they're in that like moment of just like, I can't, like mentally, I just can't. They can just look at the list and be like, all right, I'm going to, okay. I can just grab a handful of nuts and pair it with, or even just like, a packet of oatmeal or whatever, like something they can just do and then just not have to think when they're in that moment where like they're famished. Because there are times where like our brains are offline and when we haven't eaten, like that's not a time when we can expect our brain to think of things, because that's when our brain is just going to be like, nope, sorry, you didn't feed me. I don't love you.
Brain power out the window. Well, the other thing that further complicates this, we've been doing a whole series on this earlier this season, is just food noise in general. And when you, one, haven't eaten and you're already hungry. Two, you already have decision fatigue when it comes to making food decisions. And let's say you have any of the different check boxes that we've been talking about. You are constantly hearing things about what you should and shouldn't be doing about food. And then you arrive at the fridge or the pantry, or you have this like lightning bolt of awareness of, oh my gosh, I am hungry. Because another thing that we see in this population is we're kind of further disconnected from interoceptive awareness or hunger cues or anything. And finally you get that lightning bolt moment and you're like, oh my God, I need to eat something. It's been so long, or it's been whatever. And then you have all these different thoughts around what you should and shouldn't be doing around food. You're standing in front of the fridge and you're just like, I'm just not going to eat because it's easier. Because I can't make a decision around food. And a lot of that can play into what we're already seeing with malnutrition, malnourishment, and nutrient deficiencies and further GI issues. And it just makes everything so much more complicated. And I think that's why it's so important for us as practitioners to have so much compassion. Because if this stuff was easy, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah. And what I see a lot with my people with EDS is that their energy is so low and pain is so high. There's this teeny energy envelope. And if people don't catch the energy envelope and make or eat something in the energy envelope, by the time that's gone, the idea of like making food is just like, nope, I'm out. And that's so hard. Because I do have some patients where it's like they spend, I'm going to say 80 and 90% of their day in bed. And so it's like if if food isn't ready, or is going to take whatever 5 minutes, 10 minutes, like that's not going to be a thing. And so I see it as an extension of self-compassion to have things that are accessible and appealing. Almost all of my patients like have this whole idea of like how they take care of their children or their partners or their friends. But when it comes to them, it's like, and so a lot of times we'll try to go through the whole extending self-compassion to themselves and trying to use that as a way of, coming up with those things, trying to come up with foods that would offer that compassion to themselves. And yeah.
Yeah, actually, in that light, and talking about capacity, I would love if you could also talk a little bit more about the spoon levels.
Yeah, many people I'm sure are familiar with the idea of spoonies, meaning people who have either EDS or POTS or mast cell or autoimmune disease having the concept of being spoonies, meaning like you have just so many spoons across the day. And I think one of the things I had gone through in the class is like the idea of like one spoon meals, like meaning things like you could just like a yogurt, like just open the thing or like open a bar, and like 2 spoon things, meaning like something you might need to heat up. And even just coming up with meals where like super easy, meaning like just open, or 2 spoon, maybe that's like make a sandwich kind of thing where like, 1 spoon, maybe a minute, and 2 spoons maybe being 2 minutes. Again, trying to have things, lists where you came up ahead of time, like what things doesn't have to be something you love, like your favorite food ever, but things that you like enough that are going to fuel you enough where, you've planned ahead of time so that hey, these are things that are workable. These are things that I have in my living space so that when I'm tired and I need to eat, these things are here and I can take care of myself, then future me will be taken care of.
Yes. Yes. Okay. That was great. Well, this was super helpful. I'm sure extremely educational and informative for people also. So I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on. And if people do want to learn more about you or any of the work that you do, please tell them where they can find you.
Sure. My website is harriswholehealth.com. Yeah, I have a range of different things there, articles and all those things. I'm sure, put some papers in your show notes or whatever. And links and other such fun things. And it was delightful to be here to chat with you all.
Yeah, thank you.